It was the first day of the new school term, and the atmosphere in the crowded assembly hall buzzed with nervous energy. Students whispered to one another, laughing, sharing summer stories, and waiting for roll call to begin. But among the noise, a group of notorious troublemakers sat with smirks on their faces, already planning how to make the day unforgettable, for all the wrong reasons. Their target, the new teacher who had just walked into the room, carrying himself with quiet confidence and a smile that didn't waver, no matter how many eyes studied him. He wasn't dressed in anything fancy, just a simple shirt and trousers, but there was something about him that made a few students pause. It wasn't fear, not yet, but curiosity. Still, to the bullies, he looked like an easy victim. They were used to testing every newcomer, turning classrooms into battlefields where they always won. Whispers traveled quickly through the rows, about how the last teacher quit mid-semester, unable to handle their tricks, about how no one dared challenge their control. The new teacher, they decided, was about to be taught a lesson. When his name was called and he stepped forward to introduce himself, the room grew strangely quiet. He spoke softly, his tone steady, his words simple. He greeted the students warmly and promised them that the year would be unlike any they had experienced before. Some students leaned in, intrigued. But the bullies only rolled their eyes, waiting for the perfect moment to humiliate him. It happened in an instant. One of the boys moved closer under the excuse of checking the roll list. With a sudden tug, he grabbed the teacher's shirt and tore it. The sound of ripping cloth cut through the silence like a knife, followed by a roar of laughter from the back rows. The bullies high-fived each other, convinced they had just made history. The teacher stood still, his shirt hanging loosely, exposing the cruel prank for everyone to see. For a few seconds he said nothing, and the air filled with the smug laughter of those who thought they had won. But then something shifted. His expression didn't twist with anger. He didn't raise his voice or call for help. Instead, he calmly looked at each of the bullies, one by one, with a gaze so steady that their laughter began to fade. The hall went quiet again, but this time it wasn't curiosity. It was something heavier, almost uncomfortable. His silence spoke louder than words, and it unsettled them more than any punishment could have. The students who weren't part of the bullying sat on the edge of their seats, waiting to see how he would react. Would he storm out? Would he run to the principal's office? Or would he let them off like every other teacher before him? Nobody expected what came next. Within minutes, the same boys who had torn his shirt and mocked him would find themselves begging for forgiveness in front of everyone. How did the new teacher turn the tables so quickly? And what secret did he reveal that broke through the bullies' arrogance and left the entire school in stunned silence? The answer was something no one could have predicted. The silence in the assembly hall was almost unbearable. The torn shirt hung loosely on the teacher's shoulders, a symbol of mockery that should have left him embarrassed. But instead of shrinking back or showing any sign of defeat, he stood there as if nothing had happened. His calmness only made the bullies more restless. They shifted in their seats, trying to maintain their cocky grins, but something in his steady gaze unsettled them. It was as if he knew something they didn't. The students who had been watching closely began to sense that this new teacher wasn't ordinary. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't called for authority, and yet he had the full attention of every single person in the room. Some of the younger kids, who were usually too scared to even look at the bullies, suddenly felt a strange sense of safety. They didn't know why, but it felt like the new teacher was someone who could protect them in ways others had failed. Still, questions buzzed in everyone's minds. Who was this man really? Why wasn't he reacting like a normal teacher would? Whispers spread quickly through the crowd. Some said he had been in the military. Others whispered that he had once been a student at a school just like this, where he learned the hard way how cruel young people could be. Nobody knew the truth, but his silence made the mystery grow stronger. The bullies, on the other hand, weren't used to being ignored. One of them, a tall boy named Harris who often led the group, tried to laugh it off and shouted, "What's the matter, sir? Cat got your tongue?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying a flicker of unease. But the teacher didn't flinch. He simply walked across the stage, picked up the roll call sheet, and continued reading names as though nothing had happened. His composure was strange. Too strange. The bullies looked at each other, confused, because the lack of reaction felt more like a challenge than an escape. Meanwhile, in the crowd, students exchanged nervous glances. Everyone remembered how the last teacher had broken down after just a week. He had tried shouting, punishing, even crying in frustration, but nothing worked. The bullies had driven him away, and the students had learned to expect the same pattern every year. Yet here was someone different, someone who didn't bend or break. That difference carried a weight, and it made the bullies' earlier laughter feel more like a mistake. Still, no one could understand what was coming next. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of roll call, the teacher calmly folded the torn edges of his shirt, straightened himself, and told the students to meet him in class. His voice was calm but firm, and the way he said it felt less like a request and more like an order. The bullies followed with swagger, but their smirks weren't as wide. As the students moved toward their classrooms, conversations grew louder. Some were excited, whispering that maybe this was the year everything would change. Others were doubtful, saying he'd be gone before the month ended. The mystery only deepened when one of the older staff members passed by and paused, staring at the new teacher with recognition in his eyes. It was quick, almost hidden, but a few students noticed. Why did the senior staff member look shocked? And what secret did this teacher carry that even adults seemed to know? The bullies had no idea that their prank at roll call had just opened the door to something far bigger than a simple act of humiliation. The new teacher wasn't just another face in the classroom. He was someone with a past, someone who had seen more than any of them could imagine. And soon, they would learn that crossing him was the biggest mistake they had ever made. But for now, all anyone knew was that the tension was only beginning to build. What would happen when the teacher finally decided to speak? And why did it feel like the entire school was about to be shaken in ways no one could predict? The classroom buzzed with nervous chatter as the students filed in after assembly. Desks creaked, bags shuffled, and whispers bounced from one corner to another. Everyone waited to see what the new teacher would do next. He hadn't reacted when his shirt was torn, and that silence weighed heavier on the bullies than any punishment could. Harris and his crew slouched in their seats, trying to look relaxed, but every glance toward the front of the room betrayed their unease. The teacher entered quietly, carrying nothing but a small notebook. He didn't bother to hide the rip in his shirt. Instead, he stood tall in front of the class, his calm eyes scanning the room. "This year," he began, "is not about who is stronger or louder. It's about who is willing to learn." His voice was steady, almost too steady. Some students leaned forward, curious. Others stayed stiff, afraid to move. The bullies exchanged smirks, but their confidence was starting to crack. His words weren't threatening, yet they carried a weight none of them could explain. Among the students, a girl named Emily couldn't stop staring. She was quiet, often overlooked, but she had a sharp memory. And something about the new teacher's face tugged at her thoughts. She had seen him somewhere before, not in person, but in a photograph her father once kept in a box of old clippings. She remembered a headline about a man who stood up in a courtroom years ago, facing down people everyone else feared. Was it the same man? If it was, why was he here, teaching at their school? While Emily wrestled with her memory, Harris whispered to his friends, plotting their next move. They weren't ready to back down. To them, control of the school was a prize they had fought to keep for years, and they weren't about to lose it to someone who wouldn't even fight back. Yet deep inside a flicker of doubt grew. What if this teacher was different from all the rest? What if there was a reason he didn't react? Meanwhile, in the staff room, the senior teacher who had recognized him earlier sat alone, lost in thought. His name was Mr. Collins, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the school was sitting on the edge of something bigger than anyone realized. He remembered whispers from years ago, stories about a man who had disappeared after exposing something dangerous. If that man was truly standing in his school now, Then the students weren't the only ones in for a surprise. Back in the classroom, the lesson continued, but it wasn't the usual first-day chatter. The teacher spoke of respect, discipline, and choices. Every word felt intentional, as though aimed directly at those who had mocked him earlier. The other students listened with unusual attention. For the first time in years, the atmosphere in the room wasn't shaped by the bullies. It was shaped by the teacher. That realization made Harris and his friends restless. At the same time, Emily's curiosity grew stronger. She made up her mind to dig deeper, to ask her father about the man in the photograph. If her hunch was right, then the quiet figure at the front of the class was carrying a secret that could change everything, not just for the bullies but for the entire school. The tension lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. The bullies planned their next move. The teacher kept his silence, and the students whispered about the strange turn of events. No one knew that what happened at roll call was only the beginning of a much larger conflict, one that would test loyalty, courage, and the power of truth in ways they had never imagined. The days that followed only deepened the mystery. The new teacher, Mr. Grant, never once raised his voice or handed out punishment, but his presence alone began to change the rhythm of the school. The bullies noticed that students who once followed their lead were now paying attention to him instead. The younger kids whispered about how brave he seemed, and even the older ones who usually stayed silent found themselves drawn to the way he spoke. It was as if he carried an invisible authority, something far stronger than fear. But Harris and his crew weren't about to give up control so easily. Each day their resentment grew. They threw out challenges, small acts of rebellion meant to test him, late arrivals, mocking laughter, whispered insults. Yet every time Mr. Grant handled it with unnerving calm. He never lost his temper, but he also never ignored their behavior. It was the way he looked at them, steady and unshaken, that began to chip away at their bravado. Still, Harris convinced himself that it was all an act, and sooner or later, he would find the teacher's weakness. Meanwhile, Emily's quiet investigation took her deeper into the past. She waited until her father was in his study one evening and brought out the old box of clippings. Sure enough, the face in one yellowed newspaper photo matched Mr. Grant's. The headline told of a man who had stood against powerful people, revealing truths others were too afraid to speak. The article hinted at danger, at threats that forced him to disappear from the public eye. Emily's hands trembled as she read. What was someone like that doing in their small town, standing in front of her class every day? She wanted to tell someone, but a part of her knew she had to be careful. Back at school, tension thickened. One afternoon, the bullies pushed too far. They cornered a younger student in the hallway, their laughter echoing off the walls. Normally, no one would intervene. But this time, Mr. Grant appeared before they could finish their cruel game. He didn't shout. He simply placed himself between them and the terrified boy, his calm eyes locking onto Harris. The hallway went silent as other students gathered, sensing something important was about to happen. Harris opened his mouth to throw another insult, but the words died in his throat. For the first time, his confidence faltered. The next day, the entire school gathered for a special assembly. Rumors had spread that Mr. Grant would be speaking. The auditorium filled with nervous energy, students whispering, teachers glancing at one another, the bullies sitting stiffly in the back row. When Mr. Grant walked onto the stage, the hush that fell over the room was heavier than anything they had felt before. He didn't look like a man who had been humiliated. He looked like someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. The lights above buzzed faintly as the crowd leaned forward, waiting for what he would reveal. Harris gripped the arm of his chair, his jaw clenched, his friends exchanging uneasy glances. Emily's heart pounded, knowing the truth she had uncovered connected to whatever was about to happen. Mr. Grant looked over the students, his eyes pausing on the bullies, then sweeping across the room as if he could see into every heart. Everyone could feel it. The climax was near. Something was about to unfold that would shatter the old order of the school and leave everyone changed. The bullies, once untouchable, sat frozen, and the rest of the students held their breath, waiting for the moment that would decide everything. The auditorium was so quiet that every small sound, the creak of a chair, the shuffle of shoes, seemed magnified. Mr. Grant stood at the center of the stage. His torn shirt from that first day now replaced with a clean one, yet the memory of that humiliation still hung in the air. All eyes were on him, waiting for the speech that everyone thought would decide the fate of the bullies. But instead of addressing them directly, he began with a story. His voice was steady, but the words carried a weight that drew everyone closer. He spoke of a school long ago, not unlike theirs, where a group of students believed they ruled over everyone else. He told of how those same students laughed when a teacher tried to stand firm, how they mocked him and thought they had broken him. But years later, when the tables turned, those same bullies found themselves begging for the guidance of the man they once ridiculed. At first, the students listening thought it was just a parable, a lesson wrapped in storytelling. But then came the twist. He spoke with such detail, such personal truth, that it became clear this wasn't a story at all. He was talking about himself. Gasps rippled through the hall as realization set in. Mr. Grant had been through the same battles, and he had once been the victim of the same cruelty. Yet instead of being destroyed by it, he had transformed into someone unshakable, someone who could not be intimidated. The bullies shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, realizing that the man they had tried to humiliate had already faced far worse than anything they could do. But just when everyone thought the lesson had landed, something unexpected happened. From the back of the hall, the doors opened, and a figure walked in. Mr. Collins, the senior staff member who had recognized Mr. Grant before. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he carried a folder. Without asking for permission, he approached the stage and handed it to Mr. Grant. The audience watched, confused, as the new teacher flipped it open. For a moment, his calm expression wavered, and that was enough to send a ripple of unease across the room. Emily's eyes widened. She had seen the same crest printed on the folder when she looked through her father's old clippings. It wasn't just about Mr. Grant's past as a victim. It was about something larger, something official. Her chest tightened as she realized the stakes were far higher than anyone imagined. This wasn't simply a battle between teacher and bullies. Something bigger, something hidden was coming to light. The bullies, sensing a shift they couldn't understand, whispered nervously among themselves. For the first time, Harris wasn't sure if this was just about control of the school anymore. Whatever Mr. Collins had handed over seemed to change everything. Mr. Grant closed the folder slowly, his eyes scanning the audience once more. This time his gaze wasn't just firm, it carried a warning. The atmosphere thickened with suspense. Everyone could feel it. The humiliation at roll call was only the spark. What lay ahead was a fire that threatened to consume more than just a group of bullies. The school itself was standing on the edge of a secret that none of them were prepared for. Mr. Grant held the folder in his hands for a long moment, and the silence in the auditorium grew heavier with every passing second. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but charged with meaning. "This isn't just about a torn shirt," he said, his eyes moving from the bullies to the rest of the students. "This is about truth. It's about what happens when power is misused, and when courage is tested." His words cut through the air, sharp and unshakable. Then he opened the folder and revealed its contents. Inside were photographs, letters, and reports, pieces of his past that explained why he had come to this school. Years ago, he had been a student just like them, mocked and broken down by those who believed cruelty was strength. But instead of letting it destroy him, he had risen, fought back in ways that didn't involve fists or insults, and proved that dignity could outlast any humiliation. That very history was why he had chosen to return, not as a victim, but as a teacher. His voice grew firmer as he declared, "I came here because I know what it feels like to be laughed at, to be pushed down. And I also know what it feels like to rise again." The hall was silent. Harris and his crew shrank in their seats, their arrogance stripped away. For the first time they saw themselves in the mirror of his story. And when he turned his gaze directly at them, they couldn't meet his eyes. Harris stood, his hands shaking, and whispered an apology that echoed louder than any insult he had ever thrown. One by one, the other bullies followed, their voices trembling as they begged for forgiveness. The same boys who had torn his shirt at roll call now stood exposed before the entire school, their pride in pieces. The students erupted in applause, not out of celebration but out of respect. For years, they had longed for someone who wouldn't be defeated, someone who could show them that cruelty didn't have to win. At that moment, Mr. Grant wasn't just a teacher. He was proof that strength could come from patience, that courage could be silent yet unshakable. The school felt different now, as if the balance of power had shifted for good. But just as the applause reached its peak, the final twist came. Mr. Collins stepped forward, his expression grim. "What you don't know," he said quietly, "is that Mr. Grant didn't come here only to teach. He came here because this school was chosen." His words fell like a stone into the silence. The students froze, confused, waiting for more. Collins explained that the district had invited Mr. Grant specifically, not just for his teaching ability, but because of his past, because they knew this school had become infamous for its unchecked bullying. He was here as part of a quiet mission, to expose the problem and finally put an end to it. Gasps filled the room. The revelation meant that everything, the calm stares, the silence, the patience, had all been intentional. Mr. Grant hadn't simply endured the bully's attack. He had allowed it, knowing it would reveal the truth of who they were in front of everyone. The torn shirt wasn't humiliation. It was the trap that caught them in their own cruelty. As the truth sank in, the bullies lowered their heads, the rest of the students sat stunned, and Mr. Grant closed the folder with a quiet finality. "This," he said, his voice steady, "is the beginning of change." And though the conflict had reached its end, the secret mission that brought him there left the school with one final thought. If their new teacher could turn shame into strength, what else might he be planning that no one could yet see? The weight of the moment lingered in the air long after Mr. Grant's final words. The students sat in silence, processing everything that had been revealed. The bullies, once so untouchable, stood humbled in front of everyone. It wasn't just the torn shirt or their exposed cruelty. It was the realization that they had been part of a bigger story, one that showed how arrogance could crumble in the face of quiet strength. Harris, who had built his reputation on fear and control, now looked smaller than ever. His apology wasn't just for Mr. Grant, but for the entire student body he had intimidated for so long. The applause slowly returned, not the loud, chaotic clapping from earlier, but a steady rhythm of respect. Students who had once been too scared to speak out now felt hope rise in their chests. They knew something had shifted. Mr. Grant hadn't just stopped the bullies. He had shown them a different way to look at themselves and their school. For the first time in years, the younger kids walked out of the auditorium with their heads held high. The change wasn't loud or flashy, but it was real. Emily, who had pieced together his past, felt a swell of pride. She understood now why her father had saved those newspaper clippings. Mr. Grant wasn't here by accident. He had chosen to step into a place where he could turn his pain into purpose. Later that evening, Emily asked her father about him directly. Her father nodded with a knowing smile and said, "Some people carry scars not to hide them, but to remind others that wounds can heal." That simple truth gave her a new perspective, not just on Mr. Grant, but on her own quiet strength. In the days that followed, the school began to feel different. The hallways were still noisy, the classrooms still full of chatter, but the energy had shifted. The bullies weren't gone overnight, but they no longer held the same power. Harris and his friends walked more quietly, and though it took time, their arrogance slowly gave way to humility. Some even began to show signs of change, helping younger students or joining activities they had once mocked. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. For the staff, Mr. Grant became more than just a colleague. Teachers who had struggled for years with classroom discipline found themselves inspired by his approach. They saw that true authority didn't come from shouting or punishment, but from consistency, patience, and courage. Even Mr. Collins, who had carried the secret of Mr. Grant's mission, admitted that he hadn't expected such a powerful transformation to happen so quickly. The torn shirt that once symbolized humiliation became a story in itself. Students spoke of it not as an act of shame, but as the moment everything began to change. And Mr. Grant, though he never bragged or reminded them of that day, wore his quiet smile with the certainty of someone who knew the lesson had taken root. The lasting message wasn't just about stopping bullies. It was about resilience, about how strength isn't always loud, and how true power lies in the ability to remain calm when tested. The story of Mr. Grant showed the students that dignity could turn even the cruelest moment into a lesson of hope. And as the school year went on, each student carried that memory with them, not just of a torn shirt, but of the day a new teacher turned pain into forgiveness, fear into respect, and silence into lasting change. In the end, the story reminded everyone that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands steady, unshaken, until the world finally listens. And for that school, nothing would ever be the same again.